Well, good afternoon. Welcome to last session of the day, the modern OpenEdge developers tool stack. So what I want to do is I want to give you an overview of various tools that we believe should be used by developers today, especially OpenEdge developers today. Going to be a high-level overview. If there's anything you want to see more in detail, just ask me questions. We can have a discussion if you like. I would like to have that. It's not a session just about VS Code, but VS Code will be a topic in this session. Who has been in Peter Judge's session about VS Code earlier? Or who not? Few, okay. I want to talk about the tools and why I think they are important and what's the purpose of them and some challenges, different aspects. I think I'm going to skip over that quickly. Purpose of developer tools. That was actually the opposite of a developer tool. That was on Monday when I was working on one of the slide decks. Our cat decided to sit on the keyboard of my laptop and I could barely just lock the screen. So that was the opposite of increasing productivity. But the collection of developer tools, they should help me be creative. They should help me do my job. They should help me write code, solve the problems that I have to solve. They should simplify routine tasks and support writing good quality of code. For that, they should integrate with each other. If there's a bunch of tools that I'm using in combination, integration is key. And they should be kind of like a comfort zone. So when a developer starts having to fight or feel badly when using any of the developer tools, that is, in my eyes, not helping being productive. And what that means is if you just encounter that keyboard shortcuts that you permanently have to use are the ones where you break your fingers, that's probably not going to help you either. If Pro's Developer Studio, until it's ready, and really ready to write code, takes 5 minutes, or when another developer modifies code and the tool has to reinitialize, and for the next hour or longer, Carl Verbis can tell you more severe horror stories, the only thing I can use my laptop for is cooking meat because it's turning hot. That's not going to help me either. I'm losing time and I'm not fast and I'm getting frustrated, and that's definitely not the comfort zone. So in the opposite, each office should have a good coffee machine. That is, in my eyes, a very important developer tool. And the other thing, and this is not a hardware talk, but still, developers should have good hardware to run modern tools. Today's applications, front end, back end, multiple components, different back ends, you need a laptop that more or less is similar equipped to a server at some of your mid-sized customers. This laptop here, it has 32 gigs of RAM, modern, Core i7 laptop, CPU, Intel, Evo, whatever that means. It feels very fast. But sometimes the 32 gigs of RAM, you come to a limit if you're using several Docker images and big databases that you need to tune, etc. Then 32 gigs of RAM can become limiting. Definitely don't go below 8 gigs. I still see developers that are working on 4 gigabyte machines. That doesn't help. 8 gigs or more, 16 I would say is really the productive minimum. And generally, if you need to see what you get for money, I think RAM is the best value for money that you get for a developer. CPUs, if you look at CPUs, fewer fast cores serve an OpenEdge developer better than many slower cores, because a lot of what happens is single core operations. When you're building a large application and using Developer Studio, 2 SSDs in a laptop as a stripe set, or just 2 SSDs where you have different portions of the application and database and tooling and workspace on different SSDs also significantly improves performance. On our builds server, when we run multiple builds in parallel, the SSDs, the striped SSDs, are the limiting factor. So if we would put in more SSDs and have a real good controller, we believe we could run our builds on the build server much faster. And screens, whatever you want, how much space you have on the desktop should be there. So on the tooling side, there's a lot. I don't think I'm talking about secret, actually. Roland de Piper will do. Very often when we start a modernization project with customers, they have none of those. They're still using App Builder or Progress Procedure Editor on Windows or on Linux or other legacy editors. Their SCM strategy is a shared network folder somewhere with a nightly backup. That's their versioning, if they do versions. That's reality. And then I discussed with one of the customers, yeah, but you want us to work remotely for you, and we would like you to review our code before you merge into your code base, so we should introduce an SCM tool. And then they said, oh yeah, I've used Subversion before, let's use Subversion. It's free and it did work. But there are better options. Subversion was 15 years ago, or when that was. Unit testing and build automation, I mean, that's at the fast thing. Who's using build automation and automated unit tests? Yeah, just very few. And the rest of you, if you're writing code, you should. I'll have a sample on one of the next slides, which without automated unit testing would have caused us some trouble last week or this week when it would have become relevant. So, and when we then talk to customers, well, why aren't you using any of those? Big factor is lack of knowledge that these tools are available. Earlier this year, I had an initial meeting with a software partner in the Netherlands. They had a .NET department and an OpenEdge department, and for their modernization initiative, they asked one of the .NET architects to look over the OpenEdge team to support them getting more modern. And one of the things he said, I don't understand why my OpenEdge colleagues aren't using unit testing. I don't understand why they're not using any linting of the code. Isn't that available for OpenEdge? I said, yes, it is available, but they probably don't know. Or they found other reasons not to use it. Sometimes developers say, yeah, but that won't work with OpenEdge, or it won't work with our code base. Our code base is so special, we'll never be able to do unit tests. Or we have to use UltraEdit as an editor, because that's the only editor that can handle this code base fast and allow us to edit from Windows remotely to a Linux server. That's just not true. Whatever reasons, afraid of that all these tools are only available in a cloud-based scenario, and for whatever reasons we can't use cloud-based tools. And if I introduce those tools because I think that's smart, then I become the idiot that has to support all the colleagues in using those tools. There are always good reasons not to do it, but I think many more reasons to do it. So with many of these tools, the role of a DevOps that maintains these tools and the configurations for the rest of the development team becomes more and more important. Time, infrastructure, some tools cost money, but a lot of these tools cost very little money or no money at all for the software. Well, you need a server to run them on, but that's a different story. So these legacy editors, well, still seeing a lot of developers not even using OpenEdge Architect or Progress Developer, depending on which Progress developers do, depending on which version they've been on, using Procedure Editor and App Builder, UltraEdit, Notepad. I never liked UltraEdit. That's somehow. And also Notepad++. It's always when I see customers that look at log files in Notepad++ and turn that into auto-refresh mode, there are better tools to do that. And while these text-based editors on Linux, that's a kind of its own. if you just want to write code letter by letter by letter, and maybe with some basic code completion, it's good. You can be using them. But modern developer tools provide so much more. Well, let's talk a little bit about the growing elephant, Progress Developer Studio. I have been, and notes the past, the biggest fan of Progress Developer since it came out in version 10.1a. And this love affair ended abrupt with 12.5, because it suddenly got really, really slow and heavy. There are things where, well, on my faster laptop, when a bunch of code is changed by other developers and I pull that in through the SCM tool, it thinks it has to reinitialize all it knows about the code that I have there. And that process runs for over an hour. And Carl has measured 14 hours in his code base. 14 hours where you cannot do any real coding. If I'm being asked today, and it hurts to say that, if I'm being asked today from 11.7, where should we migrate to? 12.2 or 12.8? Both are LTS releases. My heart says 12.8 is the future. PSOE can do more, there's a bit more in the language. It's 3 or 4 years more LTS than 12.2. So for those users who do not open frequently, doing the biggest step at once makes them more future-proof. But Developer Studio is a blocking factor. If I know they have a big code base, and I would have to be the one who works with them through the issues with Developer Studio, I say, maybe we should stay on 12.2 with this project. And that's a really tough decision, because I'd like to be modern, and 12.2 isn't really modern anymore. It's better than 11.7, but everything except Developer Studio, 12.8 would be my choice. But we'll get to the cure in a bit. So it's based on Eclipse. Eclipse is IBM's Java IDE. So originally, Developer Studio was a Java IDE. Well, it can still work as that. IBM has open sourced that and ground a consortium with partners. Prog is also a member of the Eclipse Foundation. At least I haven't heard that Progress left the Eclipse Foundation, so Progress was contributing to the development of Eclipse. And at the time when it was released, IBM just wanted to have a strong position in the Java world against Sun, and that's why it's called Eclipse. The absence of Sun is the Eclipse. Yeah, just build Java tooling with other companies. And it is a workspace and project-based IDE. So you separate the whole work potentially in multiple projects, could be front-end, back-end, something in between, or different parts of the application. Framework versus application, so there are many strategies for separating projects into well, the whole application in different Developer Studio projects or Eclipse projects, and that configuration is put together in a workspace. And in there then you have tools to edit ABL source code, the app builder is embedded, and there's a visual designer for GUI4.net that works like the editor in Microsoft Visual Studio to drag around screens. So if you would only be using, well, a character-like application, or you had been maintaining your application in the past in the procedure editor without any GUI designer, you could do exactly the same in Progress Developer Studio, and you get a lot more out of it. You get better code completion, you get integration with other tools. Michael, had you had your session on Git in Developer Studio already, or is it tomorrow? Yesterday, okay. So Michael Schurman yesterday showed how nicely you can use interact with Git in Developer Studio. Progress has embedded all the classic tools like dictionary and the procedure editor and data admin into there. Yeah, that's the code completion. There are actually two standalone features. One is the maintaining of the REST adapter. So if you use the classic REST adapter of the app server, or in PSOE the REST transport, you have to use Developer Studio to organize calls into procedures or classes into a REST resource. That's only possible in Developer Studio, but the only other standalone feature is GUI for .NET. So if you're not using any of these, and PaaS-OE makes it very easy to have a good alternative to the REST adapter through the web transport, then there's really no hard dependency on Developer Studio. But it is good, it's well maintained by Progress, provides a good feature. One challenge with Developer Studio has always been that Progress ships a version of Eclipse and has a dependency on a specific version of Java for a specific release of OpenEdge. And especially for developers that are using still 11.7, it can be challenging to install an up-to-date Git client into Progress Developer Studio 11.7, because all the vendors of Git clients say, why should we maintain an 8-year-old version of Eclipse? So this tying of an Developer Studio version to the OpenEdge runtime version, used for build and compile and run and debug the application, I believe it would have been an easy thing technically for Progress to lift that restriction, but probably from support and testing-wise, it would have just increased the efforts there. But from the development, I don't really see any reason why a configuration switch for the OpenEdge version wouldn't be possible. And actually, in the earlier versions of Developer Studio, there was still a drop-down for the OpenEdge version, but you could never change a different value. So I assume there was an idea to make that happen, and then, for whatever reason, that didn't work. Yeah, and the big challenge right now is this OpenEdge tooling, scanning of the OpenEdge source code, the able source code. That got problematic. Earlier I said 12.5 or 12.6. Progress changed this to make it better. We don't see anything of the better. We only see that it's slower and very CPU intensive. And when I say this 1 hour that my big laptop would need to reinitialize the application when that happens, during this 1 hour, I couldn't even write emails on that laptop. It takes me 2 minutes to get into the task manager, find the Eclipse process, and reduce the priority of that process. And I'm not making this up. And I've asked a couple of users of Developer Studio 12.8 here, they all have the same experience. That is something that Progress needs to fix in a very, very soon service pack or update. Yeah. Progress Developer Studio is Windows only. Eclipse is a Java application. Eclipse runs on Macs, runs on Linux machines, runs anywhere where Java runs. But the Progress Developer Studio plugin is Windows only, but it supports the GUI and the TTY codebase. But still, I think it's much better than just still using Procedure Editor or Notepad++ or UltraEdit or VI or whatever. So, Eclipse has a plugin infrastructure, and that's actually the thing that makes Eclipse really cool. It's very easy to install additional functionality into Progress Developer Studio. Yeah, SCM integration is one thing. So if you use Git or a lesser standard SCM tool, we use internally Perforce. There are Eclipse plugins for that, and that allows you to see the history of a file, to make the diffs, commit files for all these different SCM tools. There's an SCM tool plugin for Microsoft Team Foundation Server, if someone is still using that. There are tools to follow log files. There's a JSON editor. The earlier versions of Developer Studio didn't provide a JSON editor because probably 8 years ago JSON wasn't that relevant. Now it is. And these plugins are installed through either an update site or custom Windows installers. Some plugins have dependencies on new releases of Eclipse, And then you may have to look in the archives to find a version of the plugin that still works with 11.7. Sometimes it's not the problem to keep on running a version on an old machine, but if you have to install a new machine and have to install a new plugin into that, then it may become problematic to install this plugin, because the vendor may just have put it from the marketplace and it's just no longer there. We're using Codium as a Gen AI application for coding, and works quite nice with OpenEdge. We'll be showing that later. And Codium, but all the other Gen AI plugins too, won't install in Developer Studio 12.2 or 11.7. Because Gen AI is a trend of the last 2 years. Why would a vendor releasing something for modern developers that still supports a development environment that's 5 or 8 years ago? They are also just making their life easier by reducing the versions that they need to support. So that's something that you need to be aware of. And well, if you want to use Progress Developer Studio, you may have to then take the pill of the initializing tooling. That takes longer just to be able to use a Gen AI tool. One bad news at conference like this, I've been promoting an extension to Developer Studio called OEDT. I loved it. OEDT made Developer Studio much more usable. It added much better code completion, much faster. You didn't have these times where you were hoping for code completion and it took 20 seconds to appear. It was instantly there. A much better builder, so that's a component that compiles the application. Yeah, but Lars Neumeier, the vendor of this tool, or Omicra is his company, he just announced a couple of weeks ago that Omicra is going out of business. They're closing down the business in January next year. So his title changed from a director to the liquidator of the company, which sounds quite bad. But and there are actually two reasons. One is that his personal focus moved a bit away from writing OpenEdge code, but he's also expecting that more and more developers move from Visual Studio, move from Progress Developer Studio into Visual Studio Code. And then he said, well, then it's probably not worthwhile to keep on maintaining that. Eclipse has a lot of settings that make up the configuration. That's sometimes a bit confusing. Some of these settings are stored in the workspace, others in the project. Most plugin vendors are not quite consistent in my eyes. What is project-specific, what is workspace-specific? Project-specific settings can very easily be stored in files that are synced with other developers in the SCM tool. Workspace settings are meant to be private to a developer. It's not expected that developers share the workspace with each other. So let's talk a little bit about VS Code. VS Code is not Visual Studio. Marketing did us no favor in naming it VS Code or Visual Studio Code. So it's branded as being a component of Microsoft Visual Studio, but it is a completely different developer tool. Yes, it can also maintain C# code and compile C# code and build .NET assemblies and all that stuff, but it's not sharing the same project files or solution files or whatever. It's much more lightweight, it's platform independent. You can run it on Windows, Macs, Linux, and in web browsers. VS Code has support for debugging, syntax highlighting, syntax checking, code refactoring, etc. There's an open source variant under an MIT license, but the product that we usually install is under a proprietary Microsoft license. According to a Stack Overflow survey from last year, almost 3/4 of the developers that responded to this survey, well, how representative that is another question, said they are using VS Code. I'm not reading they're using it exclusively, but they're using it potentially along other tools. But 3/4 of all developers is significant. I personally started using VS Code as my everyday editor for everything besides ABL code. So when I had to edit ini files or batch files or whatever, I kept on using VS Code for quite a while. I don't know exactly how long. Our web developers have been using VS Code since years as the main editor, or the only editor that they're using. Yeah, so it is significant. So VS Code, by design, supports various programming languages. And to my understanding, that support is really more key of the strategy than when IBM released Eclipse, opening up Eclipse for other programming languages. Microsoft has released a specification for a protocol called the Language Server Protocol, LSP. That is part of Microsoft's open specification, so everybody can implement an LSP according to this specification. It's a network protocol that that allows the IDE as a front end to communicate with a process that understands the language, and that actually provides all the code completion and the build commands and the syntax check. So VS Code is just a nice, pretty front end with sometimes a little bit funky keyboard shortcuts. Jill Riverside have implemented a language server following the Microsoft specification that knows how to deal with OpenEdge code. And the language server actually has two components. It's a Java portion that does all the interaction with VS Code. Jill is a more Java programmer than an OpenEdge programmer, but when you deal with network messages, multi-threading is important. The ABL is not a multi-threaded language. So that's why there's a Java layer, but then the actual compilation is done in normal OpenEdge runtimes, either TTY or GUI. It's very lightweight. Unless you overload it with plugins, it starts in seconds. But also with plugins, I learned from Jill very recently that plugins that don't start and initialize themselves in under a minute will be killed during startup, just to get the IDE up quick. And they all start in parallel. So when you have 20 plugins installed that do something in parallel, it starts 20 threads and they all initialize themselves. And those that are not done in a minute, they will be shopped. Jill had, a couple of weeks ago, he had a version where he became slow. We were joking with him whether he now tries to become as slow as Progress Developer Studio, and then he fixed that, and now he's clearly under the minute again. And in that minute, he's doing the same stuff that Developer Studio does in over an hour. Because the code completion that he does is equally good. And from the lightweight editor, it scales up to a full-blown developer environment. So I can give a quick demo. There's a couple of key concepts in the UI that in the beginning are a bit complicated. One thing which is actually nice when you're presenting stuff, it scales very nicely using Control plus and minus on the keypad. Because what we look at is not a desktop application. We actually look at a browser-based application. When I run VS Code on Windows, it's running in the Electron shell, and that's just a browser shell that you can run a browser-based application on the desktop, and that's why the scaling is so nice. And so there's a project explorer. So in this environment, I do have a couple of projects. Some of these projects have a configuration for building OpenEdge code, and others don't. So I use this also to maintain the configuration of my PassOE. Use this as really the only editor that I need to use. But I can also open, just random pick of ABL code and edit this here. And through the integration for OpenEdge, when I do a compile error, you get the red lines, and there's a problem to use with the actual compile errors It sometimes happens that it's showing you the compilers for the previous file, but now it's up to date. And as soon as I remove the error, it's done. And also this compiling, now, I mean, it's not a big class, but it really feels like it's instant. Developer Studio just takes a deep breath before it shows me whether or not my class is ready. So speed is really the main aspect. On the keyboard shortcuts, there's some keyboard shortcuts that I had to get used to. Control comma brings you into the configuration, and then you can search for various settings. But the most important keyboard shortcuts, and probably that's going to be how you see whether a developer is using VS Code or not, is whether the P key loses its color, because there's Control P, and that's opening this omnibox there to open files. And you can search for wild match patterns, just like the uppercase or with asterisks and rec access. And the other menu that you will get used to is Control-Shift-P, which opens the same menu for actions. So if I want to start the data dictionary, then I do Control-Shift-P and just type dict, and then I get this list of data dictionaries. Why isn't that showing me the projects? Well, don't know. So Control-Shift-P is the next shortcut to get used to, and then there's Control-Shift-O for the outline. So that's the list of the methods and properties in this class, and that allows me to navigate to the code. Yeah, and if you are switching between Developer Studio and VS Code frequently, and you do Control P, you'll realize that Control P in Developer Studio is printing, Control Shift O in Developer Studio, no, Control O is the outline in Developer Studio, Control O in VS Code is opening a file. So Control O brings up the Windows Open File dialog. So then that's something, well, it takes a bit to get used to that, and yeah. You can split windows nicely. You see here this integration that allows you to do side-by-side diff to the next, to the last version of the code. On the right-hand side is the version that I have. On the left-hand side is the previous version, and that's a full-blown editor, so you can change the code in there while you compare it to the previous version. I have a screenshot soon of some more nice diffing things. One thing which is really cool for those of us who are not so Linux savvy as I am, there's a concept of remote editing on Linux. VS Code is probably best described as a client-server application as well. You have the front end, that's what we see, and that's what we press buttons on, and there's a back-end portion. Now, if I'm doing it all on Windows, this front end, this back end is running both on my laptop. I'm editing local files. But through the front end, you can very easily deploy the back end of VS Code through an SSH connection to a Linux server or to a Mac machine. And when you do that, all the operations you do with files and all the compilations that you do through Jill's plugin in the language server don't happen on Windows anymore. Windows is just a pretty front end. They happen on Linux. And that is for whenever I have to remotely edit and debug files on a Linux machine, my days of using mpro are over. Unless there's a strong reason that I can't, well, I need an SSH shell to do mpro anyway, so from the infrastructure, I cannot really see a reason why VS Code couldn't be used anywhere that I can SSH and do mpro in. So, and that's actually quite cool. So there's this green button in the bottom left of the status bar, open a remote window, and then the Omnibox asks you what. So do you want to use the Windows subsystem, the Windows subsystem for Linux? So actually the Linux which is part of Windows 11, or do you want to connect to a host? So if I connect to a host, I could see a list of pre-configured hosts. Marbles is our Linux build machine. And then I either get a password prompt, or when it's configured in my SSH profile that it uses certificate-based authentication, then it won't prompt me for username and password. VS Code doesn't have a password store there, so it's either you type in the password or you configure a public-private key pair for authentication. And then, yeah, you see there's some output. That's when the backend is started on Linux. The first time you see how the Windows front end transmits a file to the SSH server. Then when you open a folder to work with the files there, you already see that the prompt shows you Linux file systems. And then when I open a folder in the files and I see the same file browser there, and I can edit a Progress file. And if I have the language server configured, so with OpenEdge database connection and ProPath and whatever, then on the Linux environment, through an OpenEdge properties, OpenEdge project JSON file, then it will compile the files on Linux and run them there and debug them there. That's pretty cool. Yeah, VS Code plugins. Extensions. I can't get used to that term. VS Code has a very vibrant plugin ecosystem. Those are enhancements to the IDE. Provide support for additional languages or file types, code checkers, unit test runners, and so on and so on. VS Code as a tool, unless you block it, is automatically updated on a monthly basis. So on, I don't know, is it typically the Microsoft Patch Tuesday? When you start VS Code, then you just see the release notes of the latest version. So unless you actively block it, you'll never run the situation that your development environment is so outdated that you can't run the most recent plugins. So plugins or extensions are installed via the VS Code Marketplace or through so-called VSIX files. And that is a bit weird. VSIX, that's the same file type for Visual Studio extensions. If you download a VSIX file and you have Visual Studio installed along with VS Code, by default the Visual Studio installer will start and say, ooh, this is a VS Code plugin, I don't know what to do with this. So you have to install them from within VS Code. Typically then the vendors of the VSIX files will tell that currently with Riverside, the actual plugin for editing OpenEdge code is provided through the marketplace. That's very easy. You just search there for OpenEdge and you find that plugin there. But the SonarLint plugin provided by Riverside, that is not yet on the marketplace. So you can download the VSIX file from Riverside's website, and then you have to install it manually. It's not a lot of work. Plugins also automatically frequently. You can fix a plugin to a certain version. Plugins can have a stable channel and a developer channel. We're typically on Riverside's developer channel. Every now and then, a developer version, an unstable version is really unstable, and then we force it back to yesterday's version or the version of last week. But it's possible. Yeah, and with the Riverside plugin, it definitely works with 11.7, 12.2, and 12.8, and Jill says, and probably also with earlier versions. So maybe if you're in 11.6, you can still use it. Not tested by him, but we don't see any reason why it shouldn't work. So on the plugin side, I'll show a couple ones in this talk. We use a plugin to execute able unit tests, which is very nice. We use a plugin to run ARN scripts on build events. So when we change file, we can run an ARN script. That would allow for compiling the same file after you compiled it for the Windows runtime, compile the same file into a different folder for TTY. We use it to extract certain elements of the source code. Annotations, Progress doesn't provide us access to annotations at runtime yet, so we get them when we still have the source code and store them along the code. There's a spell checker. I was asking Progress for the last 20 years to enable the procedure editor in Progress Developer Studio to support spell checkers, because Eclipse has spell checkers, just language spell checkers, so that my English comments and class names are spell checked. And with that, we found a couple of typos in class names that we have. And then we always now have to see, because we deployed the code in the last 10 years to our customers, we always have to see, well, can we fix the typo in the class name? Is it something that we only use internally, or is it something that our customers would be using and would cause them trouble? But a code spell checker is really nice for comments and method names, class names, etc. Templates, that's one thing that was really irritating in the beginning when we started using VS Code. There's no concept of templates for new files. Out of the box, you always create an empty file. For a procedure, it's just a little bit annoying. For class files, adding the usings and yeah. And if you're so used from Progress Developer Studio that you always have the block level on error no throw, that you just don't have to care about it, the first few classes that we wrote in VS Code, we just forgot about it because we had to type everything and yeah. So now we're using this file templates plugin that brings very nice templates there, and it's actually very easy to provide any number of custom templates, much easier than it is in Eclipse. We use a plugin called Jenkins Check that allows us to look at the status of our Jenkins build. So that's the point about the integration. So I don't have to go into browser, log into our Jenkins, see whether a build was successful or not, or run a build. I can do that through Jenkins Check and dozens of other Jenkins-related plugins. Well, we just tested 3 or 4, and then we found Jenkins Check and said, well, we don't want to try the other 50. That just works well enough for us. Jira and Bitbucket are integrated. There are various editors for ResX files, for GUI4.net resource files. There are various plugins for Swagger support, and don't ask me for a number. That's really a growing field. And a very simple one, just to show the name of the workspace that I'm in the status bar, because sometimes I'm working in different workspaces, maybe the same application, but for different versions of Progress, and I just want to see that somewhere. A question, and well, I feel sorry for that, but it was a little bit funny when it was raised. I was talking to one customer and they said, yeah, we're considering to go to VS Code, but we've recently introduced Git as a versioning tool. And it was so difficult to install a Git client in Progress Developer Studio. Does VS Code include a Git client? Yes, that's one of the few extensions or things that you would expect to be an extension that are in the box. You don't get VS Code without Git. It's always there. You can VS Code install as a normal user. Then it will be installed in the app data folder, app data local, Microsoft, whatever. But then a developer who isn't administrator on the machine can also update that monthly. Every developer should be administrator on his own machine. It's really, but I know customers where that's not the case. I know customers where in order to update anything, the lead developer who knows the admin password has to go around to 10 machines, type in his password, upgrade the stuff, and I think that person has more important things to do. But yeah, maybe it keeps him important. But I think on his own PC, if a person whom I don't trust to keep his Windows PC in order, I wouldn't trust him to develop a Windows application. And for things you can harm outside your local PC, well, that's a different story. But on the local PC, I strongly believe a developer should be admin. But, well. So with the Git client, I hate using the Git command line. When I'm at a customer and I have to work with Git, and I don't have my preferred Git client, which is Git Kraken, yeah, I can always install VS Code there. And use it just as the graphical Git client that I can use everywhere free of charge. With Git Kraken, I would need to carry around my license and all that stuff. VS Code is really easy to carry around. The settings concept of VS Code is really, really cool. It has similar layers for storing these settings. So there is the project or folder-based settings. And they are stored in files in a .vs Code subfolder, which the dot indicates that on Linux it's meant to be a hidden folder. And those settings can be versioned. The workspace is a single file that basically points to projects, but can also contain settings. And the workspace is a file that you can also distribute with other colleagues through Git or Perforce or Subversion or whatever SCM tool you're using. So any configuration change that's relevant for the whole team is very easy distributed, much easier than in Eclipse. But there are also user-based settings. Like if you change keyboard shortcuts, that's considered being user-specific, and other configurations. For some configuration, you can decide yourself whether you want to keep it as a user, project, or workspace setting. The same settings available on all three layers. The nice thing then about the user settings, you can sign into a Microsoft account. So every Office 365 user has a Microsoft account and sync the settings then using this account to all your PCs. And so that could be a desktop PC in the office and a laptop or multiple laptop, whatever. And that's really cool. You can, if the different projects require different settings, different user settings, there's a concept of different profiles. You can separate that, but you don't have to. And in general, it gives you a lot of control about that. And most of that are JSON files, so easy to read and edit. And one thing which is also cool are recommended plugins. So when we started using the ABL unit plugin or any of the other plugins that had Jenkins check, well, one of us installed it, tried it, played with it, and we said, yeah, everybody should be using that. You can mark a plugin as being a recommended one for a project or a workspace, and then any other developer that gets the updated workspace file, the next time he starts VS Code, will be prompted to install that plugin automatically. Also very cool in a team. So when you are in the marketplace and you have a plugin there, I think I have a pointer here, there are various settings. So there's the, why doesn't that work? There's the auto update. Well, now I can remove it from the workspace recommendation because it's part of the workspace recommendation. There will be an add workspace, and that just adds a line to the JSON file referencing the ID of the plugin. The ID is human readable. It's not a GUID. It's typically a mix of the author name and the plugin name. So if you want to see it in the workspace file, you will see it there under the workspace recommendations. Well, I think I've answered that question before. How can we do that with OpenEdge? Well, there's the plugin by Riverside. They've been doing tooling for OpenEdge developers since quite a while. I think PCT is way over 20 years. So it's partly open source, partly closed source. So the plugin part, which basically launches the language server and does the code highlighting, that's open source. The language server is closed source, but it's free of charge, and it will remain free of charge. Works with various OpenEdge versions. You've Sonar and Cable support through another plugin. So this is what you need to look for in the marketplace. You just install that from there and configure your project, and you're ready to go. It's under active development, and you can see that if you go in the plugin page and go just into the option to install an earlier version, you see that, there are multiple releases a week, unless Jill goes on vacation. But very frequently. Did anybody say something about French people having too much vacation? Jill has far too much vacation. He needs to get done with this. yeah, you get editing with rich code completion, compile against both runtimes. I'm going to speed up a little bit to get to the other things. Limitations, there's no concept of any UI designer integrated. So there's no idea of embedding the app builder into VS Code like the app builder is embedded into Progress Developer Studio. You can launch the app builder from there, and if you open a .w file in VS Code and then you use a command to launch the app builder, it will open exactly that file. And when you then make changes in the app builder and save it, VS Code will immediately show the changes there, but there's no embedded graphical designer. Data Dictionary can be launched. There's no UI designer for GUI for .NET, and Jill doesn't have plans to do that. So it's really for code. And VS Code as a platform also doesn't have really foundations for graphical editors. There's some plugins that when you're editing HTML code, they will show the result of the HTML code side by side for web developers, but you can't drag around fields there and the code gets updated. That's just not part of it. And maybe that's part of the idea how to keep it lean and fast. Yeah, for OpenEdge developers, there are, I think, these 3 dedicated plugins. If you know anything else, it would be nice to let me know. There's the Able Unit Test Runner Pro Bro, which is a little bit like the data digger embedded into VS Code, maintained by Baltic Amadeus, and Pro Peak, which visualizes the output of the OpenEdge profiler, with quite some interesting graphical views into it. Yeah. SCM tools. Yeah, my experience that many developers don't use SML tools yet. Use shared source code in shared folders, or their own OpenEdge application that maintains source code. And well, if that works for you, okay. But SCM actually is the central hub that provides the source code to various developer tools. And for instance, SonarLint doesn't expect a file server to tell which is the developer to blame for a certain code issue. It wants to ask the SCM tool, hey, who has changed that line of code? Through plugins. And Git plugins are always available. Perforce plugins are available for the most. Microsoft Team Foundation server plugins are commonly available. Subversion, I would hope they're not available to get people away from Subversion. But SCM tools are really important in the key chain. In a team, I wouldn't know how you maintain a good code quality and adherence to coding standards without code reviews. And Git is a tool that has a very dedicated concept of code reviews and working in feature branches, and the code could only merge into the main code line once another developer says that's okay. So it's always a 4i principle. Yeah. So Git is probably right now the leader. Command line is great for breaking fingers. You have these nasty comments with either single hyphens or double hyphens. I don't know, there's 3 hyphens. And you have the nasty Git commit hashes, a 6-digit hexadecimal number that indicates a commit. It's not sequential. It's more random. It's a short version of a GUID, actually. But even I start to accept that Git is the future. We're using Perforce. Perforce is a commercial tool, and it reminds me in many aspects of OpenEdge. It's rock solid. I believe it's the best SCM tool in the world, like the OpenEdge database. Nobody knows it. For many years, Perforce was the only commercial software that Google ever used. But Google has also switched to Git. Perforce is the king of branching and merging. Whenever we work in bigger projects with Git, branching and merging can become a hell. And in Perforce, it's just hassle-free. It just works so nice. We barely never create wrong merges. When Perforce says, yes, I know how to merge it, we almost trust it blindly. And with Git, we're way more skeptical because of bad experience. Perforce makes it better. Well, Microsoft has stopped developing Team Foundation Server. Team Foundation Server Microsoft, when it came out, appeared a little bit like a better version of Subversion with a couple of concepts stolen from Perforce. But Microsoft is now also fully into Git. The standard version control tool for Microsoft Visual Studio is Git. And VS Code brings the Git client out of the box. So, yeah. So if somebody starts new with version control, I think the only choice is Git. If you look into Git, there are various variants of it, or various distributions. I think the big players are GitHub and Atlassian Bitbucket. GitHub and Atlassian Bitbucket, and quite a few people are using GitLab as well. But also most Linux-based distributions provide a basic Git server. They may not have the concept of pull request and browser-based front end to it, but from a command line client or any graphical client, doing commits and branching and diffing works with those too. There may be limitations on how you configure access to different branches. In Bitbucket or GitHub, it's quite easy to say only certain developers are allowed to commit to the main branch and everybody else has to use a feature branch or a bug fix branch and so on. So, Bitbucket, since a couple of years, is just cloud-based. Okay, there's still the data center version, which is way over my bank account. Right. But the GitHub on-premise version is way cheaper than the Bitbucket data center version. Yeah, I need to correct it. There's the data center version for Bitbucket for large user accounts. For the most other people, it's cloud-based. And some companies have a problem with putting the source code in the cloud. And with one customer in Switzerland, they, for that reason, have now moved to GitHub from Bitbucket, or in the process of doing that, to be able to have the version control in-house or on a server within Switzerland and not anywhere else in the world. And there's some quite cool extensions to the Git support. There's a tool called GitLens, and that provides you with these light gray by default lines when you hover over a line of code with who changed it when. And if you click on it, you get this hover with lots of hyperlinks, and from there then you could go into the whole history of that commit and through the Jira ticket and whatever. So it's, yeah, very nice integrations with other tools. So the SCM tool, when we look at a larger tool stack, well, that's where you edit code, and then the SCM tool should be taking care of isolated feature development, so feature branches and how you merge them together. The way that the source code is delivered to build automation is through the SCM tool. Test automation, the same. Code checking, linting, the same. Then code reviews all through SCM. When you need to maintain variants, customizations for OpenEdge releases or variants for different customers, that is then also typically done through SCM, and SCM tools can support during deployment or automate deployment, so being a foundation for the automation there. So both tools integrate with various of the SCM tools out of the box or via plugins. Yeah. SonarCube. SonarCube is a code scanner for all kinds of languages, .NET, Java, JavaScript, more legacy languages. And through a plugin by Riverside, also supports ABL code and does static code analysis, so it reads the source code and finds issues there based on rules and logic implemented in the in the plugin. It's visible in Developer Studio and VS Code value type, and it provides a web dashboard for monitoring. If we look at this code, there are a couple of issues there. So the obvious ones is the variable j is defined but never used. What are the issues in the last line? If I understood Wim right, he said, yeah, well, we are having a substitute pattern with 2 arguments, but 3 actual arguments there. So and I either shouldn't pass n as a third argument or add a placeholder for &3. That's one. What else is wrong in that line? LC1 is not the problem, LC2 is the problem. So one of the variables, that are passed here is a long char. And based on that, the result of the substitute function is a long char, not a character. No. Based on that, it could become longer than a character, but since the pattern is a character, the data type of the pattern determines whether substitute returns a character or a long char. So that means I could have more than 32,000 characters in LC2, and then this assignment would blast at runtime. And runtime failures that, I don't know whether that actually crashes the runtime or crashed it. I think it crashes the runtime. It's one of these std item, whatever, system error, std item out of space errors. They're really nasty. And would you have found that yourself on day-to-day coding? No, but the cable rules do. So 2 lines in such a innocent-looking statement. So what's the problem line 34 or 35? Yes, so I was undecided whether the assignment of n equals 4711 is still part of the condition or should be unconditional. If it should be unconditional, like a new statement, it should be indented here or not indented at all. But most likely that period is there by accident because I copy and pasted something in there and I just forgot about the period. And that's especially bad with 2 things. As soon as you have 3 things, most likely the compiler will tell you that you have 2 assignments without period or outside of an assigned statement. But that is typically an indication of a logic problem. And looking for dots on the screen is really nasty. And those can cost a lot of time when you have to debug them. And probably question a couple of times whether you need a stronger pair of glasses. So you see them as a developer, both in VS Code, but also in Pro's Developer Studio. Would show the same in Pro's Developer Studio. By default, the scribbly line is blue. Here it's yellow, but I believe those colors are customizable. You see that in a web dashboard, so that's visible to everyone. You see that we've introduced 1 new code smells. Code smells are not as bad as bugs. What of the 200 rules in the cable rule set you configure as or see as a bug or just a code smell, that's something you can configure. But everybody can look at that and decide whether we're ready to release the software with still this 1 code smell left. Some of the code smells are as trivial as not using the right or configured casing for keywords. When you want uppercase keyword and you have a lowercase keyword in the code, then that's a smell. It's not a bug. It doesn't change the way the code runs, but it may have an impact on readers of the code. And if you're doing unit test, it shows you the percentage of the modified code or new code that you've committed that is covered by unit tests. We have set our unit test limit to 40%. If we fall under 40% of the code modified in the last 2 weeks, then we will not release. We will add more unit tests to cover that modified code. And with that relatively low rate, I mean, first I think with 40%, I'm probably much better than most people here in the room. And generally, there are only 2 people that know their unit test coverage. Those people that don't do unit tests know they have 0%, and those that use a tool to measure. But since we have, as part of our tooling, some graphical code which is difficult to unit test, we always look not just at this ratio, we also look, hey, have we done more GUI code that is difficult to unit test, or more backend code? And for the backend code, we want to get more closer to 80%, and for the UI code, we know it's hard to achieve any coverage at all. So we don't take this number really as a hard limit, but when it's getting too low, then we look at the codes that we've written and whether we shouldn't be adding unit tests. And with the unit test coverage, then you can look at the files that were modified, see the coverage of changes. So we see that in this action type plugin, and that's a plugin into a tool that's difficult to test, we actually cover 0%, and then in other files we cover 85.7% of the lines of code. And then you can dig in further, and you see the yellow highlighted code is new code, so that falls into this 2 weeks period. So we actually don't have a unit test for this else return empty string case. So now we can decide whether it's relevant enough to add one, to spend time on it. I mean, in the end, it's a trade. Do I spend the time equals money now on writing that unit test, or do I want to spend the time and money when a bug comes in to find out whether it's there? SonarLint, there's a free version and a commercial version, multiple commercial versions. The community edition, which we are using, only allows us to use the SonarLint parsing on the server in the main branch or in a single branch. If you want to scan your feature branches to know whether the coding style rules and the security rules are met before you merge code from the feature branches into the main line, you have to use one of the commercial editions of SonarLint. And for us, that would be a subscription of, I think, 3,000 or 4,000 euro a year, based on the code base that we have. Since a developer is seeing the rules being shown in the developer studio, call me naive, but I believe a developer should be responsible enough to pay attention to that. So when we merge into the developer branch and then we see that the developer missed something, then we fix it then. So, unit testing. And luckily, last week, we had a situation where unit tests saved our life again. A colleague installed OpenEdge 12.8.4 on our build server, and half an hour later, she logged a ticket saying we have 5 failed unit tests. And the only thing that changed was the version of OpenEdge. If nothing else changes, it's very likely that it's that. We have a couple of unit tests that sometimes fail because we parallelize the unit test to be faster, and sometimes we have interference because of parallelization effects. So I ran it again, and it was still failing with exactly those 5 tests. And those 5 tests weren't tests that I expected to fail because of these parallelization issues. Well, then I had on one machine also already 12.8.4, and I tested the unit test there. It failed as well. I had another machine with 12.8.3. The unit test did not fail there. So that was for us the evidence it was OpenEdge version related. And today we actually got the confirmation from Progress that this is now considered a bug that was introduced because they fixed another bug. Ta-da. Yeah, I mean, since for us in notification time, our build and unit test pipeline runs for 23, 24, 25 minutes, depending on the temperature in the room, air pressure, whether we run 2 in parallel or just 1. So that's why we knew half an hour after we upgraded to 12.8.4 on the build server, we have a problem with 12.8.4. And I don't think you can be notified any faster. And then it took me the rest of the afternoon to implement the workaround. So we could actually, when we ran into this, I emailed a couple of customers saying, hey, I know you're keen on going to 12.8.4, but please wait until we've analyzed this issue. And I don't have to do this very often. I think the last time I had to do this was 5 years ago. But then the other day, when we confirmed that our workarounds were working, also on earlier versions of OpenEdge, we were able to give them green lights. Said, hey, here's the one file. If you use this, you're good to go with 12.8.4. But I'm not expecting this only in the life of a framework developer. I'm expecting these situations in the life of every application developer. Nobody can tell me that he wouldn't be benefiting from the situation of knowing for zero cost at that point in time, when you pay for it earlier, writing these 19,000 unit tests took time. But nobody can tell me that for his code base and his application, it's not important to have a very good coverage of unit tests and know whether a new Windows version, we had that too, that Windows versions caused problems, or new versions of OpenEdge are causing problems. It's not just our own code that's potentially breaking stuff, it's the stuff that we are depending on, operating system in OpenEdge, or Java, or whatever.
Well, the big question is why Progress doesn't apply unit tests.
You could ask Stefan how many colleagues within Progress Software are actually good OpenEdge programmers. There are people that write OpenEdge, but not so many people that write in OpenEdge. So I don't know how many ABL unit tests are part of the OpenEdge test suite. I don't know. But they didn't have one for this case.
But the case that I read as well, that it is when you have a corrupted document.
Well, we could discuss about corrupted, but that would be a beer discussion. But it was a change in behavior. It was working like that for at least the last 10 plus years. We were really concerned whether we used it in exactly that way 11 or 10 years ago. But it has been working since early version 11s. So it was at least an undocumented change in behavior. And today it got confirmed as a high priority bug. And Peter said that in his history of working for Progress, he rarely had bugs that came in that were marked so quickly without any escalation effort as high priority. So Progress seems to be afraid that other people are using that too. Well, we're already over time, but I can give you, well, I'm going to skip the demo of ABL unit in Developer Studio and we'll go straight into VS Code. So in the VS Code plugin for ABL unit, so it uses the same unit test runtime that Progress has developed for Developer Studio. So that's quite cool, so you know that the same tests are running and should be behaving the same way. When you have a couple of unit tests, there's this, so how do you call this glass in English? This here, it's not a Petri glass, what is it? So this laboratory thing, so that opens the unit test view, and the unit test view is standard in VS Code. So the plugin just provides the ability to run ABL unit as a test runner. And it lists tests in your project, and you can filter by a naming pattern to get to the tests that you currently care about. Because as a developer, I usually don't run all the unit tests on my laptop, on my desktop. I just run those ones where I know those have something to do with the functionalities that I'm doing now. And to do the whole 19,000, I do that on the build server and I wait for 25 minutes for the result. So then you see the error message of the test at the line of the method. And when you hover over it or click on it, then you see the whole stack trace there and stuff on that line, and you can click on any of the lines in the stack trace and it opens a file and goes straight there. So the presentation of the test result is actually nicer than in Progress Developer Studio as well. And it can, and I thought that was broken, but today I learned that it's just an alternative way of running. It also supports to visualize lines that have been executed during the unit test in the code. When you enable that feature, it will show the lines that have been executed while running that unit test in green highlighted in the source code, and the ones that haven't been in slightly red highlighting. So when I navigate the code in the developer environment, I see the unit test coverage there as well. And that's pretty cool. So in the case where I'm missing a test for the else return empty string, probably if I would have turned on the feature that I didn't know about, that it had become an optional feature now, I would have immediately added a test for the else return empty string. So it's this plugin. Ken Herring is an OpenEdge developer, and he cannot do many other things on his evenings than working on this, because when you follow this on GitHub, there's a commit, there are multiple commits almost every day. We use unit tests also for additional code checkers. We've written unit tests that check whether we have enough comments in the code and whether we have a dedicated comment for each parameter, because we use those method comments and the comments on the parameters for generating our online class reference. So that's important for us because it provides value to us and our customers. For the GUI4.NET forms that we're using, we're checking whether in the resx file there's a localizable setting, because we can localize the GUI4.NET forms, but only when all the strings are in the resx file, not when they're in the source code. And therefore, each of the forms need to be set localizable, so we've written a unit test for that. We have unit tests for the database schema. We check whether the trigger path in data dictionary has been inserted with forward slashes and without the SRC prefix, because that is a mistake that probably everybody did, backslash passes in triggers, and yeah, they fail to run on Linux. We want that all of our tables have a unique index, so we unit test for that. We don't want to have tables, fields, slops in the schema area. We want to use UTF-8 for all the lops, all the clops. So that's the stuff where we load the df file into a database on the build server, and then we have unit tests that for each through the meta schema tables. And there we're using our test runner. Our test runner is compatible to able unit, but it can do a little bit more. So we can have test runners that actually just create records in this e-test case temp table, and that is reported as unit test failures. So when we create 2 new triggers with false passes or so, then they pop up as unit test mistakes, just like anything else. So that we just have one central tool to look for all the unit tests. So then we see here was a unit test where we actually forgot a missing localizable attribute in a GUI4.NET form. And then the build in the build server turns yellow. It's not red. Red is a critical failure that it didn't finish. Yellow just means one of the tests or multiple tests have failed to execute, have failed to deliver the right result. So we run that after every commit. The unit test phase are 12 minutes. Before that we compile, that's 4 minutes. We set up databases and Docker machines because we run some unit tests against an PathOE in a Docker container and stuff like that. And yeah, that makes it run in total something between 22 and 25 minutes. If we run 3 in parallel, it's going to be an hour. Because we parallelize the tasks so much, run multiple tests and compilations in parallel, that if now we run the double or 3 times the load in parallel, then the machine is just at its limit. And when we write functionality, we really, since long time, we typically don't write a .p to test functionality as ad hoc functionality. We really start with the unit tests. We write a unit test for the methods that we're writing. And that's how we test it. That's how we test whether it gets a right result. And yes, in early stages, we still add message statements to the unit tests to get some intermediate values. But the procedure or the class that executes our code the first time is always going to be a unit test. We have used for some ARN scripts to be executed from the development environments. One simple use case would be an ARN script that just deletes all the R code before you do a compilation. And we have an ARN script that extracts the annotations out of the source code so that we can use them at runtime. So we want them to be executed. And in Eclipse, there's a concept of an ARN builder for this code. You have to install an extension to do that, the ARN target runner. Funny thing is, that's also developed by an OpenEdge developer, but it's a plugin that's also usable completely outside of the OpenEdge world. The question was whether there's a reason why we don't use Gradle and the like. The honest answer is that when Progress came up with the DevOps framework and the Gradle plugins and all that stuff, we had already been using ARN and Jenkins for so long, I didn't want to switch from ARN builds to Gradle. And that's why Gradle just has never become relevant to us. But maybe we are in the same position as many of our customers. We're just not using the right tools because of lack of knowledge, lack of time, lack of interest. Maybe somebody can convince me of spending time with Gradle, and then next year we'll be using Gradle for this. But that was not the honest answer. It was just never became relevant for us. So on the documentation of the ARN target runner, you actually see samples where he shows the DLC code and has targets to delete Progress ARC code. So it is not OpenEdge specific, but it comes from an OpenEdge developer. I find it quite interesting. And that's also quite an indication that a lot of the initiatives for adding OpenEdge specific functionality into VS Code, they're not coordinated or managed in a way that are just like the plugins that Baltic Amadeus wrote and Gilles' work. They started independent from each other, and this one too. Hopefully, a conference like this help to bring those guys together and probably make it possible to benefit from each other. So now a completely different topic, Gen AI. For us, the first real touching points with OpenEdge and I were sometime last year around last year's PUG challenges. Alas from Helmus, he was doing a session on Gen AI and OpenEdge. He wanted to do a session here as well, but he is sick, unfortunately, and cannot come. And so he asked us whether for that session last year, we could be providing him some RESTful services with a Swagger documentation that he could teach ChatGPT how to use our REST services, and that allowed him to do natural language queries to the Sports 2000 application. So he could write a question like, which customer ordered that item, blah, blah, blah. And it was translating that into REST calls. And we had other customers doing similar stuff, but they really haven't been involved that much. So Gen AI, generative artificial intelligence, yeah, it's the species of AI that produces some result, generates some result. The GPT in ChatGPT is a generative pre-trained AI, so somebody has taught this AI something. And teaching AIs is quite important. And it can generate, text, images, videos, some fun stuff, maybe some dangerous stuff. So in software development, Gen AI can support developers for writing code. And there are basically two ways how it can do that. There can be prompts. The developer can type an instruction, write me a method that does X, Y, Z, and then hopefully the Gen AI builds a method that does something that fulfills those requirements. And for many cases, that replaces graphical wizards where we click through and say that, and now you write a sentence. For some languages, Gen AI is quite good at refactoring code. I mean, for refactoring code, you need to understand the existing code and how it should look like in a new structure. For ABL, there is just not a lot of publicly available code to train AIs to do that. You can use Gen AI to generate code. You can mark a method and tell it, what does this code do? It reads records from the customer table and it updates the state field based on blah, blah, blah. And this explanation is typically a good base for a comment describing what the method does. But while you're typing, it can also do proposals for actual code. We have started using, oops, it's still German, Codium as our AI assistant. If you want to use this one, you need to pay attention because there's another Codium without the E. Codium, this is Codium.com, and there's a Codium without the E.ai. It's just another assistant. The reason why we've chosen this one, I read an article about that, and the author of that article was pretty convinced that, especially for intellectual property reasons, this AI is better than GitHub's Copilot, because it only learns from code that you could actually use in a commercial application without any license implications. The model that I train with everyday use is just for my own purposes, so I don't help teaching an AI that would help my competitors to write better code. That is a touchy point. Maybe we all as ABL developers should be more open there, but yeah. And just a few samples. So when I start typing define variable, actually it took it a few hours to learn that when I start a variable with an I prefix, it's going to be an integer. And without any previous knowledge of ABL, it learned very quickly that all my defined variables have no undo. In some instances, it can be so smart that when I have the same variable name singular and plural, it proposes for the plural one an array. With objects, a list of objects or an array of objects, depending on what I used close to that. In some codes we use more arrays, in others we use more lists. It's quite cool. So here I started writing a method process order, so meaningful method name is good. Define variable, and it thought, oh, in other methods that were named something with order, I used an instance of our ORM wrapper, the order dataset model. So maybe the first variable I want to define is an order dataset model. And I can accept that now just by clicking tab. The reason why I don't do this live is, well, John called it the AI hallucinations. There are hallucinations, but there's also the aspect that it's not really deterministic. I cannot guarantee that when I do the same stuff today, it proposes the same stuff that it proposed last week, probably because of the stuff that myself and my colleagues have done in the week between. So, yeah. I accepted that, so I probably want to create a new instance. I probably want to find a record based on the input parameter. I probably want to throw a meaningful error message when that record is not there. So all that is stuff that it just proposes while I write the code. And this year, that's something where also after a couple of weeks of using this, again, a tool that is not specifically trained for OpenEdge. And I really almost physically fell from my chair when that happened. So that's old code. That's a class that uses a JSON file and can assign values from the JSON file to static properties in the application. That's what we use for configuration. So various classes of static properties which are just there to receive configuration values. So we're going through that JSON document, and since we need to know the data type of the property to query that and assign it to the progress property, which is integer in 64 or decimal, we need to have a case distinction. So that code was relatively old. So when we wrote that and we wanted to do the logging in the log file, we were still using straight the progress log manager handle. which means it's always writing these messages when a log file is available. And in the meantime, we developed APIs that where we can turn on and off individual log messages. So, and I was going that code for whatever, and I realized, it's still using the old API. So I created a task to, refactor it to use a new API. So far, so good. So I started that. And so I then use now our log manager class without the hyphen, write formatted message. There's now the message subsystem, which allows us to turn it on and off through configuration. And the message here in the integer case, if it's an integer property, refers to an integer. And when we look back, we see here that we have the else case. So a number is either integer, int64, or decimal. That are the three types of messages. And the junior developer that developed at that time was doing copy and paste mistake. So we were having in the message an integer. And the more senior developer who reviewed the code, that was me, didn't realize that. So we had that bug there for years. So now Codium kicks in. And so after help, so I had to do the first one manually. I don't remember whether it was the second one it helped me already. But with the third one, I just entered an empty line there. It has learned now that instead of the if log manager blah, 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 I now want to use this. And guess what's in the proposal? It guessed that A, integer int64, the third numeric value, is decimal. Or it got it from, we had the get decimal here to get the value. But either way, it took it out of the context of the program. And they said, Well, after continuing to use it for a couple more months, I'm still not convinced that human developers will go out of work very soon. But that was quite impressive. And the cost for the tool are $20 per month per developer. So it's really not something that is holding me, the cost is not holding me back from using this. But it requires Developer Studio 12.8 because of the Eclipse version or Visual Studio Code to do this. You can't do that in 11.7 Developer Studio. You probably don't do that in UltraEdit or Notepad++ or VI. So I think that was the last slide. Questions? If not, then thanks for your time.